The air in the apartment on Claremont Avenue in New York City was thick and sweet with the smell of stale pipe tobacco and fear. It was September 1939, and outside, the world was already collapsing into the abyss of war. But here, inside apartment 405, the catastrophe was not just political or military, it was mathematical, existential, and frighteningly pure. The Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard, a man whose restless mind perpetually buzzed with invention and foreboding, stared at the single sheet of letterhead paper from Columbia University. He wasn't looking at the crisp typeface or the neat signature. He was seeing the impossible geometry of a chain reaction and the mushroom cloud it would inevitably birth. He was looking at the end of the world, and he knew it had been his own theoretical hand that had sketched its outline. Szilard had been among the first to grasp the implications of the neutron discovery and the subsequent fission of uranium. He saw it not as a scientific curiosity, but as a blueprint for a weapon so powerful that it would render all previous warfare obsolete. And now, the terrifying kicker: the only nation on Earth with the industrial capacity, the necessary materials, and, most chillingly, the sheer ideological ruthlessness to pursue this doomsday project was Nazi Germany. Szilard didn't need a crystal ball. He needed a simple list of recent events. Germany had just halted the export of uranium from the captured Czechoslovakian mines. Germany's foremost theoretical physicists were being silently recalled from their academic posts. The message was clear. A secret research program had begun, and the prize was not territory or oil, but the power of the sun itself, harnessed for mass murder. This realization wasn't an academic problem. It was an intelligence crisis of the highest order. But how do you tell the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, that a piece of theoretical physics, understood by perhaps 24 men on the planet, was about to decide the fate of civilization? Szilard, the émigré with an accent as thick as plum pudding and no political pull, certainly couldn't. He needed an emissary, a figure of such towering, irrefutable moral and intellectual authority that his words could not be dismissed as the rantings of a paranoid refugee. He needed the man whose very name was synonymous with modern thought, Albert Einstein. The journey to Einstein's secluded summer retreat on Long Island with fellow Hungarian physicist Eugene Wigner felt less like a drive and more like a pilgrimage to the oracle. They found Einstein in his simple home, a man whose legendary white mane seemed to absorb all the light in the room, working on a separate, serene universe of unified field theory. When Szilard laid out the terrifying facts, the potential for an atomic bomb, the German interest, the necessity for a U.S. program, Einstein listened with a profound, almost biblical sadness. His response was immediate and unequivocal. The threat was real. He agreed to sign the letter Szilard had drafted, a document that would not merely inform the president, but warn him. The resulting letter, dated August 2, 1939, delivered not by courier, but by an amateur economist and Wall Street financier named Alexander Sachs, became the single most consequential piece of paper of the 20th century. It began politely, "Sir, recent work by E. Fermi and L. Szilard leads me to expect that the element uranium may be turned into a new and important source of energy in the immediate future." It ended with a clear-eyed prophecy. A single bomb of this type, carried by boat and exploded in a port, might very well destroy the whole port, together with some of the surrounding territory. Roosevelt, besieged by 1,000 other crises, initially shelved the letter. Sachs, a man whose persuasive technique was legendary, returned and insisted on an audience. Finally, in October 1939, Sachs sat across from the president, not just reading the letter, but improvising a dramatic historical parallel. The story of a young American inventor named Robert Fulton, who had tried to convince Napoleon that his newfangled steamships would change naval warfare. Napoleon, Sachs recounted, had dismissed Fulton, a mistake that cost France naval superiority. "Mr. President," Sachs concluded, "if the Nazis get this bomb first, we will be in Napoleon's position." Roosevelt paused, staring out the window, his mind tracing the grim trajectory of a world ruled by a nuclear-armed Hitler. He looked at Sachs and said simply, "Alex, you are after all this time still an alarmist." Then he rang a small bell on his desk. When his aide entered, Roosevelt pointed to the papers and said, "This requires action." The single quiet decision had just launched a project that would cost billions, employ 500,000 people, and forever change the relationship between science, the military, and the American state, the Manhattan Project. The project's initial code name, an innocuous bureaucratic cover, was the development of substitute materials. The ultimate mission was not to make a bomb, but to win a terrifying, invisible, high-stakes race against the purported German Uranverein, or Uranium Club. The scale of the undertaking quickly outgrew the polite confines of academic laboratories. It was a project that demanded a military mind, a man capable of forging a continent-spanning enterprise out of secrecy, raw logistics, and the fragile egos of Nobel laureates. That man was Brigadier General Leslie Groves. Groves was a formidable figure, a man built like a bulldog and possessed of an almost terrifying operational efficiency. His prior triumph had been overseeing the construction of the Pentagon, the largest office building in the world. He was the kind of man who didn't tolerate delays, excuses, or most importantly, breaches of security. When he was assigned the project in September 1942, he had 3 non-negotiable demands: complete command authority, the highest priority rating for materials, and the right to select the project's scientific director. For the scientific leadership, Groves bypassed established giants and chose an unlikely mercurial theoretical physicist with a history of left-leaning politics and a penchant for poetry and self-doubt, J.R. Oppenheimer. It was a choice that confounded the military establishment. Oppenheimer was brilliant, yes, but he had no administrative experience, a questionable security profile, and a demeanor utterly unsuited to the rigid discipline Groves demanded. Yet Groves saw in Oppenheimer a unique blend of theoretical insight and leadership charisma. The one man who could speak the language of every scientist, from the quantum theorists to the metallurgy engineers, and bind them into a single, cohesive force. The project demanded secrecy on a scale never before conceived in American history. It required an entire, fully functioning city to be built from the ground up, virtually overnight, and erased from all public maps and records. This city was Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Oak Ridge, or Site X as it was known internally, became the industrial heart of the bomb effort. The site was chosen for its remote location, its abundant power from the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, and its ready access to water. In 1942, it was a quiet farming community. By 1945, it was a metropolis of over 75,000 residents, a human experiment in extreme compartmentalization.
The vast majority of the residents, mostly women recruited from across the country, had no idea what they were making. They worked in 3 colossal, bizarre-looking plants, K25, Y12, and S50, whose sheer size dwarfed anything ever built. They monitored thousands of dials, adjusted endless banks of switches, and handled untold quantities of uranium compounds, separating isotopes by methods ranging from gaseous diffusion to massive electromagnetic calutrons, machines that look like a cross between a factory floor and a gigantic, complex series of copper magnets. The workers knew their job was vital to the war effort. The signs everywhere declared, "Silence means security." But they only knew their specific, narrow task. A woman operating a console in one room might be separating uranium-235 from uranium-238, the key to the bomb. But to her, it was simply the process. No single person outside of the top command chain was allowed to know the entire terrible equation. The project was divided into 1,000 pieces, each handled by a loyal but unknowing American, creating a human security lattice where no spy could ever gain the whole picture simply by flipping one worker. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles away, hidden deep within the high desert mesas of New Mexico, was another, smaller, more esoteric secret city, Los Alamos, or Site Y. This was the intellectual core, the place where the how of the bomb was being figured out. Groves and Oppenheimer had selected this remote location, the site of a defunct boys' school, to ensure the volatile mix of brilliant scientists were isolated, forced to work together, and cut off from the gossip and distractions of the outside world. Los Alamos became a kind of military scientific utopia, or perhaps a high-security intellectual pressure cooker. The greatest minds in the world, Enrico Fermi, Richard Feynman, Hans Bethe, and a cast of thousands of other physicists, chemists, and mathematicians were suddenly living side by side in barracks, working under fictional names and struggling with the most challenging physics problem ever posed: how to make two subcritical masses of fissile material come together fast enough to generate a catastrophic nuclear explosion before the process blew itself apart. Oppenheimer, the ultimate theorist, proved to be an unexpected master of practical organization, hosting discussions that could pivot instantly from esoteric quantum theory to the logistics of high-speed explosive lenses. He walked the dusty pathways of Los Alamos, his thin frame hunched over, a cigarette perpetually dangling from his lips, presiding over the creation of a weapon that would both save the world and condemn it to a future of perpetual fear. The scientists battled two fundamental designs: the simpler gun-type assembly, which would fire one piece of uranium at another like a bullet, and the far more complex implosion method, which required a perfectly spherical, simultaneous detonation of precisely shaped conventional explosives to crush a plutonium core inward. The sheer technical impossibility of the latter design became the obsession of Los Alamos. It required a level of mathematical precision and material science that simply had never existed. In this atmosphere of frantic invention and relentless secrecy, however, there was a fatal, crippling blind spot, an astonishing lapse of security born of the very nature of the scientific community. The scientists were focused on the German race. They never considered that their Soviet allies might be running a race of their own, and that Soviet agents were already walking among them, listening and taking notes. The most extraordinary spy was not some shadowy operative flown in from Moscow, but a mild-mannered, intellectually meticulous German-born theoretical physicist named Klaus Fuchs. Fuchs was a man of impeccable credentials, a true refugee from the Nazis, a respected member of the British delegation sent to Los Alamos, and an essential contributor to the implosion design. He sat in the most critical meetings, understood the mathematics of the blast wave, and personally worked on the final trigger mechanisms. He was the ultimate insider, and every few months, Fuchs would take a quiet drive into Santa Fe, meet his Soviet handler, Harry Gold, and hand over a packet of papers that contained the most precious and deadly secrets in human history: the exact weight of the fissile core, the intricate geometry of the explosive lenses, and the physics of the initiator, the very soul of the bomb. Fuchs was not motivated by money, but by ideology, a profound, almost religious conviction that the United States and Britain could not be allowed to possess such a monopoly on apocalyptic power. He believed the only path to a stable, post-war world was a balance of terror, a nuclear parity between the capitalist West and the communist East. And so, as the brilliant minds of Los Alamos worked themselves to exhaustion, believing they were racing only against Hitler, the truth was far more astonishing. Their every successful calculation, every breakthrough, every hard-won piece of data was being meticulously, perfectly copied and flown across the Atlantic straight into the nascent Soviet program. The secret of the American bomb was not just secure, it was already lost, transferred by a quiet man who kept the history of the world tucked inside a brown paper bag. The clock was ticking, not just toward the German surrender, but toward a fateful summer morning in the New Mexico desert that would define the American century. The scientists and soldiers, driven by a powerful moral imperative to end the war, were building their own successor state, the atomic age. The astonishment of the project was not just in its scientific achievement, but in the fact that it was, from its inception, a ghost project. Its most crucial data already haunting the geopolitical future, unbeknownst to the very men who bled and calculated to bring it forth.